Assalamu alaikum. I am UR Rehman, student of Water Resources and Irrigation Engineering, and studying at University of Engineering and Technology, Texla, Pakistan. Welcome everyone to this presentation. I am happy to participate in 10th International Conference on Water Resources and Arid Environment. The title of my research is Modeling of Rainfall Runoff Responses for Flash Flood Mitigation Using Nature-Based Solution. Table of content: abstract, introduction, material and methods, experimental description, results and discussion, and the last one is conclusion. Abstract: a rainfall simulator was used to perform experiments to examine the effects of flexible vegetation means grass, rigid vegetation means large trees, and the combination of both means combination of flexible vegetation and rigid vegetation. On runoff generation under variable rainfall intensities, and results were compared with barren land means no vegetation, and the peak discharge QP attenuation means the difference between the peaks of two hydrographs. Time of concentration TC, flow volumes in recession limb means VR, and falling limb, representing by Vf of the hydrographs, were also calculated. It was resulted that the attenuation and time of concentration represented by Tc were maximum for mixed vegetation. Mixed vegetation means flexible and rigid both. And Qp means peak discharge, Vr means rising limb, and Vf means falling limb, were maximum for no vegetation condition. The artificial neural network models were tested to develop best relationship model between rainfall and runoff. The results from three ANN models with different training functions were compared to find the best possible solution by using these variables, namely precipitation, time, and the time of concentration, and one output means Q naught runoff. Introduction. In the modern world, nature-based solutions are widely adopted by many countries which are developed and also the countries which are underdeveloped. Nature-based solution approach is used to minimize climate change impacts, enhancing resilience in areas of meteorological risk to society such as flooding and sustainable development. The rainfall and runoff responses are the key factors contributing to the total discharge reaching urban drainage system. A little knowledge exists about nature-based solutions to cope with the flash flood. A laboratory-scaled rainfall simulator may be used to study the relationship between runoff and rainfall by using vegetation along the hilly area. The rainfall simulator generates rainfall through sprinkles with variable rainfall intensities. The equipment has also been used in many countries like India to study rainfall runoff relation in hilly terrain. Previously, rainfall simulator was used by many researchers for generating runoff in the study area, which was further used to predict erosion along the roads. It was also used to develop a relationship between sediment yield and runoff under variable rainfall intensities in a vineyard plantation in Spain. Hence, the researchers approved that the rainfall simulator could be a useful tool in representing the natural rainfall conditions. Thus, various models were previously presented to simulate the rainfall runoff relation. Among these models, synthetic hydrographs were used to quantify runoff responses generated from the hill torrents having forests. The artificial neural network modeling is a powerful tool in simulating hydrological process which has been intensively used in the modern world. It was mentioned in the previous research that simulation of artificial neural network in rainfall runoff modeling and developing flood hydrographs was satisfactory. In the current study, rainfall runoff responses were analyzed by using rainfall simulator at laboratory scale. The symmetrical slopy areas were modeled in the reservoir of the rainfall simulator to make similar hilly conditions of the hill torrents. Runoff was measured from hilly model without any vegetation, and results were compared by putting the flexible vegetation, rigid vegetation, and the mixture of both flexible and rigid. At the end, artificial neural network modeling was done by testing three models, and the best predicting model was recommended for predicting rainfall runoff relationship. Now here I will discuss the materials and methods. In the current study, rainfall simulator in the Water Resources Laboratory at University of Engineering and Technology, Texla, in Pakistan was used for experimental investigation of rainfall runoff responses in barren hilly area, means without any vegetation, and the green hilly area means where the vegetation was present. The equipment consists of networks of rainfall pipes, rainfall sprinkles. There were total 11 number of rainfall sprinkles and discharge measuring wear and control valves. The dimensions of equipment were: the width was 1 meter, the length was 2 meter, and the height, we can say the depth of the box or tank was 0.12 meter. The hill model was made of polystyrene sheets, normally also known by thermocol sheets or thermopore sheets, with length 1.85 meter and width 1 meter. The inclined length of the model on both sides of the rectangular channel was 0.026 meter. 0.26 meter. Width of the channel was 0.23 meter. The remaining width of the model was horizontal as shown in the next slide. The slope of the hilly area model was 27 degree. The dimensions of the model on each side of the channel were kept almost symmetrical with area. Here is the isometric view of rainfall simulator line diagram, and the second diagram is the line diagram of the hill model. And the area A1 and A5. The area A1 and A5, here is the area A1 and here is area A5. These both areas were same and this surface was flat. A2 and A4 were also same, and the arrows showing the inclined surface whose angle was 27 degree, and A3 is the channel, rectangular channel where the precipitation, after the precipitation starts, then the water from all the catchment area starts moving to this channel, and this channel moves in a longitudinal directions as the arrows are representing it. After placing the model without vegetation, the rainfall sprinkles were started having uniform rainfall over the whole catchment area. There were three rainfall precipitation spells, P1, P2 and P3, that were tested against each case. P1 was 0.03 meter per second, P2 was 0.05 meter per second, and P3 was 0.06 meter per second. 0.06 meter per minute. Hadrographs were developed by taking the runoff values from the computerized rainfall simulator. Firstly, three rainfall spells were sprinkled on the model with no vegetation. In the second step, the flexible vegetation in the form of artificial grass was placed on the polystyrene sheets to examine the effect of flexible vegetation on the runoff generation and hydrographs. After this, effect of rigid trees on the runoff generation and hydrographs were tested, and the results were compared with the no vegetation condition. For each case, hydrographs were developed. Previously, it was stated that the time of concentration means the time required for runoff to reach at the outflow of the equipment is termed as time of concentration, was found as a key variable for explaining the experimental results related to runoff rainfall relations. In the current study, time of concentration was calculated for each case. The sprinkles were run for 5-minute interval for each rainfall spell, which is kept constant for all the cases to examine the difference in the hydrograph peak at the same time interval When sprinkles were off, the runoff decreases resulted with no runoff after some time. The slope of the equipment was 0.01 for all the cases. In this study, when all the cases was done, so all the cases with flexible vegetation, with rigid vegetation, and with the mixed vegetation, means the combination of both flexible and the rigid vegetation, were compared with the no vegetation conditions like a barren land condition. Here are the pictures for different conditions when the experiment was done. The first one is the no vegetation condition. Second is showing the flexible vegetation, and the third one is showing only the rigid vegetation, and the last one is showing the combination of both flexible and the rigid vegetation. Here are the experimental description. These are the case ID. No vegetation, only at precipitation 1, precipitation 2, and precipitation 3. Similarly, the next one is the single vegetation with single lane at precipitation 1 and precipitation 2 and precipitation 3. And the next case ID is the single vegetation with single lane. Means at precipitation 1, precipitation 2, precipitation 3, it's basically showing the single lane of the rigid vegetation. SR1 means single rigid line. And the last one is the double vegetation mix with precipitation 1, precipitation 2, and precipitation 3. So all four cases were here all four cases are mentioned, and the three cases of vegetation were compared with the first one in which the no vegetation was present. Here are the results. Hadograph. Hadograph is a graphical representation of time on x-axis and discharge or flow, and discharge or flow on y-axis, having three main components: rising limb, crest, and falling limb, as shown in the diagram. And the rising limb and then the crest, and the last one is the falling limb. VF here it is representing the falling limb. This is the crust, and this one in the curve is rising limb. The result obtained from no vegetation model against precipitation 1, precipitation 2, and the precipitation 3 showed by the increasing the intensity of precipitation, peak of hadrograph was increased, as shown in the next figure 3b. Here we can see that when there was no vegetation with precipitation 1, precipitation 2, and precipitation 3, the peak was maximum for maximum rainfall intensity, for high rainfall intensity. The hadrograph comparison between no vegetation case and with vegetation case showed that for all the cases, peak of the hadrograph was observed for no vegetation cases, and peak was decreased by placing flexible vegetation, which was further decreased by placing rigid vegetation. Means that rigid vegetation contributed more to decrease the peak discharge as compared to the flexible vegetation. The minimum peak was observed for mixed vegetation cases against precipitation 1, 2, and precipitation 3. Now, the attenuation of the different hadrographs were measured. The difference of peaks between the two hadrographs is termed as attenuation, as represented in the next picture. It was resulted that the attenuation of the graphs is relation to highest hadrograph for no vegetation only was maximum in percentage for double vegetation mix, because double vegetation mix case showed maximum resistance of flow of rainfall from the hills to contribute to lateral flow in the channel. The maximum attenuation achieved in the case of the double vegetation mix was 90%, and minimum was 29% for single vegetation. Here are the graphs between discharge and the time. Basically, these are the hydrographs, and we can see that the peak of each hydrograph when no vegetation, then this blue line shows that this blue line of the curve shows that the peak was maximum. Similarly, it was decreasing for single vegetation with flexible, and the third one, which is a light gray color, and the peak is more low than the blue and the light yellow. And the last one is the double vegetation mixed condition at precipitation 1, whose peak is very low than all three cases. So here we can see that the precipitation 2 for all four cases. So in this case also the peak was minimum for double vegetation, like the combination of both flexible and rigid vegetation. Here for the precipitation 3, here we can also see that the peak of the discharge was also low but comparatively high than for the precipitation P1 and P2. As the P3 is more precipitation than P1 and P2, therefore the discharge peak was also little high than other two cases P1 and P2. Here we can see that the relationship between precipitation and attenuation. As the precipitation was high, the difference in the attenuation was low. Here we can compare. We can see that when the double vegetation means the rigid and the flexible combination of both rigid and flexible, and then also here we can see that its little peak is less, and here the peak is more below than the other case. Peak flow and time of concentration. Peak flow is the maximum flow at the crest of hydrograph as represented in figure as given in the next slide. It was also noted that the peak flow was increased by increasing the rainfall intensity from P1 to P3. The analysis of time of concentration suggested that T3 time of concentration was minimum for no vegetation case and maximum for double vegetation mixed case. Means the combination of both flexible and rigid. So the effect of flash flood can be reduced by increasing time of reaching water from the hill torrents to the downstream and downhill side. Hence, the best suitable condition was in which the maximum vegetation was used, means the flexible and double lane conditions of the rigid vegetation was used. So this was the best condition in which we can control the peak of the flood. Here, volume of flow in recession limb and falling limb. The impacts of flash flooding may also be reduced by decreasing the rising limb and falling limb, volume of rising limb and volume of rising and falling both limb. The flow volume under the curve of recession limb and falling limb was calculated, and it was observed that the volume for the rising limb and the volume for the falling limb were reduced by placing vegetation, and minimum values were observed for DVM cases as shown in the figure. We can see that for the DVM, double vegetation mix means the combination of flexible and rigid both. Here we can see that the peak discharge was very low for this case comparatively for no vegetation, single vegetation, and flexible vegetation. Similarly, here also it is mentioned that the time of concentration and the precipitation. The time of concentration was maximum for the double vegetation mixed case and was minimum for the no vegetation condition, as there will be no resistance to the flow when there will no vegetation, and the resistance will be maximum when there will be more vegetation. So in the case of double vegetation mixed case, the time of concentration will be high. Here we can compare the rising limb volume of rising limb and precipitation, in meter per minute. This graph is representing the relationship between rising limb and the precipitation. This graph shows that the volume of water for the rising limb was minimum for the maximum vegetation condition. Uh, and as here in the light blue color, double vegetation mix, flexible and the rigid both. And here volume of falling limb and the volume for the falling limb and the precipitation P. But here that was not much difference for this case, but there was also a little bit difference for the both conditions. And for no vegetation it was little high as compared for the maximum vegetation condition. ANN modeling. The ANN is the artificial neural network is one of the artificial intelligence techniques that simulates the actions of the human brain with the help of neurons. The input and output values for ANN model are presented in the table 1 in the next slide. The inputs were precipitation time and the time of concentration with single, and the outputs were Q naught and the N of the ANN model, and the ANN model's performance factors were R square, root mean square error RMSE, and the mean absolute deviation MAD, and sum of square error SSE. For ANN modeling, 67% data was selected for training and 33% for validation. Here are the ANN model IDs: ANN3, ANN5, and ANN6. Basically, these 3, 5, and 6 are the number of neurons that was used, and the all R and the results of R square, RMSE, and mean absolute deviation and SSE were generated through the software. And here is the representation of the ANN model results, inputs, working of the neurons, and then the final result Q naught. And here the training, and this graph shows the training of the inputs and the outputs, and this is the validation results for the from the ANN model. Pakistan have been faced 23 flood events since 1947, resulting in an estimated loss of almost 38 billion USD. Thousands of people were dead and zero point 0.6 million kilometers square irrigation land was affected. The frequency of these floods has been increasing alarmingly. In 2022, heavy monsoon rains and floods have been impacted 2.3 million residents in Pakistan, demolishing at least 95,000 homes and damaging another 2,24,100 acre area. Among these flood events, the impacts of flash floods were absorbed was very rapid and high. The victims of these flash floods are mostly the poor people living near the floodplain or at the hilly torrents. So this research will help to reduce the impact of the flood. In the conclusion of all this research, I am here to describe the conclusion. Keeping in view all the above results, it is calculated that the peak of hydrograph is directly proportional to the intensity of the rainfall. The peak discharge was maximum for no vegetation condition. Flexible vegetation condition reduced the peak, which was further reduced by the only rigid vegetation, and by applying both mixed vegetation and the flexible, the peak was minimum. The time of concentration with respect to without any vegetation condition was maximum, and for mixed vegetation condition it was minimum. Volume for the rising limb and falling limb were maximum for no vegetation conditions and minimum for the mixed vegetation condition. And the last one is by decreasing the time of concentration peak charge, volume of for the rising limb and volume of the falling limb will definitely reduce the impacts of flash flood because it will provide the community more time to respond and overall impacts of flash flooding that will also be minimized. That will also minimize the peak of the flood, and in this way the community can take its measures to be safe. Furthermore, it is recommended that the effective slope of the rainfall model and different conditions can be used we can also calculate the vegetation density, and it can should be analyzed in the future. And these are the references for the different papers that I have studied to get help for this research.